Hi, my name is Faith Stacer, and I chose position one, which was about the two divided regions, the North and the South. Let's get into it. During the late 18th century, the United States was made up mostly of agrarian communities along the Atlantic coast. The United States had a population of less than 3 million people, and they were very, very small and very rural, except for the major cities like New York and Philadelphia. As the 1860s rolled around, the United States was a very booming country with a new and improved population of over 30 million people due to expansion toward the western regions. Soon there was a significant division between the North, which was focused on industrialization and manufacturing, and the South, which was focused on agriculture and farming. How may this difference lead to war, you ask? I'll explain. So, when the North was mostly focused on industrialization and factories, they got to the point where they were not reliant on like slave labor, and that created more job opportunities. While in the rural South, the agrarian economies were solely reliant on slave labor and plantations. Slavery became a problem and grew many tensions when the North started expressing their deep feelings on the issue of slavery in the South. When Abraham Lincoln opposed the expansion of slavery when he was elected in 1860, it pretty much made war inevitable. Compromises like the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850 temporarily relieved tensions, but they did not last for long. How the compromises temporarily prevented war was by addressing the key problems between the North and the South over the topic of the expansion of slavery. The compromises were a failed attempt of balancing both of the interests of the parties. The Missouri Compromise tried to resolve the conflict by declaring Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state, also in addition to making slavery legal along the Louisiana Territory north of a specific latitude line. The Compromise of 1850 was essentially the question of whether the new territories gained during the Mexican and American War were going to allow slavery. The Civil War helped show that slavery wasn't just a regional problem, but it was a whole national problem that affected more people than just the North and the South. All in all, there were many differences between the North and the South that ultimately led to the Civil War. Slavery played a very crucial role in the matter. Thank you.
The position that I have chosen to focus on is slavery and its role in the Civil War. A big idea of this position is the idea that nations are held together by similarities in culture, and when these similarities begin to differ, the nation unravels. It's a very popular belief that the people of the North were more poor and looking for factory jobs and couldn't afford slaves, and the people in the South were richer and aristocratic slave owners. Many people believe that it is due to these differences that the Civil War began, but the beliefs of this position differ. It believes that the North and the South weren't as different as they appeared. It states that the majority of people in the South were poor farmers and couldn't afford slaves. The disagreement with slavery started with the evangelists, who believed that slavery was a sin. There were more and more free people of color in the North, and the Southern slaves were seeing this and seeking freedom. Due to this new crave for rebellion, many Southern slave owners prohibited their slaves from learning how to read and write, so they wouldn't understand the newspapers. Slave owners also pushed the belief that the abolition of slavery would have a very negative impact on the economy and politics of the nation. The real anti-slavery movement began in the 1820s, and a big turning point for this movement was Harriet Beecher Stowe's anti-slavery book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which became the second best-selling book of the 19th century, second only to the Holy Bible. The election of Lincoln began a wave of fear in the South because Lincoln was tied to the Republican Party, who openly pushed for the abolition of slavery. At first, Lincoln intended to respect slavery where it was already prominent, but he also wanted America to be free soil for all, and so he did want to abolish slavery at some point. Southerners believed that Republicans would eventually force the abolition of slavery, and that the only way to protect slavery was through breaking free from the Republic and gaining their own independence through war. The South began the war, but they bit off more than they could chew. They ended up losing the war because the North was so far ahead of them in manufacturing. After the war, slavery was officially abolished. The main purpose of this position was to make it clear that the war was less over the differences between the regions and more about the sequences of conflicts and interests. This makes my position different from the others because the other two positions heavily focus on the differences between the North and the South. All three of these positions make it very clear that there is no way that the nation would be able to continue to run smoothly with these differences, so there had to be a change.
So the third source talks about how the regional differences really separated the two sides of North and South, and that the South and North were different in almost every single way, whether it came to social life or political views. They did not agree. After a while, Southern extremists began to fearmonger other Southerners and spread rumors that the North was going to give away or take away their slaves. And this, in turn, made other Southern leaders and politicians to say the same things so that they would not be seen as soft. And when Lincoln came into power after the election of 1860, Southern leaders thought that it would be seen as soft to not secede from the Union that threatened what they viewed as their rights. Something that the first and third source have in common is that they talked more about the cultural differences and how that was the main reason why Southern states seceded. However, the first source talks more about social life and how they differed between the two sides, and the third source talks more about political differences. And the third source also talks about the Southern extremists that swayed the Southerners to think about seceding. The second source opposes that cultural differences was the main reason that the Southern states left, and it points more to political disagreements between the North and South. It also talks about how it couldn't be cultural differences because almost every nation has cultural differences inside them, and it is mostly apparent only during Civil War or when you try to paint the opposing side as evil or something like that, different. And both the second and third source talk about political differences.